at our workshops, we've always had, a section where we speak about the license, the OAI license, and in general about, open source licenses. We've had panels in the past. In this workshop, it's a little bit special because we have two, finally, presentations. There was one that Christina just gave. And now Jimmy is going to speak more about the open source license aspects. So Jimmy, he's a board member at OpenAirInterface Software Alliance for Ericsson, representing Ericsson. And he's also a longtime friend and supporter of OAI, years and years, even before Ericsson was a member. And Jimmy specializes in open source licensing policy, license policy. So he's the perfect guy to talk about this.
Yeah. So, oh, you had more slides. I didn't know you had more slides.
Here, so
let me take us through this stuff by PowerPoint.
Good luck.
More slides.
I never cut my slides at the end, so okay. Good.
Here we go. Here we go. That almost caused a work injury. Okay, so I'm being rather brave doing this because I stand between about 100 people and lunch, and most of you engineers, and I'm going to talk about licenses. So, disclaimer, I'm also a lawyer by training, so this is going to be illegal, but let's try to connect it back to what Christina said earlier and why it's so important, why the OpenAirInterface license is so important, and why it really is a license designed for business, for 6G and beyond. I think sort of, Irfan, keep me honest, but at least it's like 8 years old now? Something like that, right? Yeah, so I think it stood the test of time. It has shown sort of been really remarkable in allowing sort of industry that comes from one way of thinking around patents and IP, and have prior obligations to standards bodies related to FRAND, to still come in and openly collaborate also on the software side in a project like OpenAirInterface. Frankly, I don't think that would be possible under a license that didn't take in those commercial realities and the sort of complexities and just the way the telco ecosystem is structured and how it works. I don't think that would be possible to have this kind of success if we weren't there. But in the first instance, why do we even need a license, right? Isn't it just good enough that we share the code? So there's going to be a little bit of a crash course in sort of legalese. No, it's not good enough that we share the code, because what you have, code is protected by copyright. Little slide here. Code is protected by many things, one of them being copyright, right? That's at the very heart of it. If we didn't have code, we wouldn't have anything, right? So code is copyrightable material, same as a novel, same as if you make a creative drawing, because coding is fundamentally very creative. So copyright is created automatically when you create a work that is copyrightable. You don't necessarily need to register it. It is transactable. I can sell you my copyright. That's what novelists do, what journalists do. They sell their copyrighted work. And that's based on the fact that it's a negative right. I have the copyright. I have the exclusive right to this, right? I can choose to grant that right under certain terms to the people I choose to do that, either for monetary or for non-monetary compensation. But it's my choice as the copyright owner. So that's the first step. The code is protected by copyright. It's a negative right. So unless there is something telling you, yes, you are allowed to use this code, then you're not. Just because something is available on the internet doesn't mean that you're allowed to use it, right? So the second part of sort of this software thing, it's patents. And patents don't necessarily protect the specific expression of something. They protect sort of the function that the code would perform. So you can copyright, okay, I can write this in a different way. It'll be fine. I don't infringe your copyright. Patents, I can't write really, it doesn't really matter which way I write this function that the code is supposed to perform, because it would still infringe that patent, because it protects the function, right? So they're kind of implementation agnostic, and they are transactable as well. I can sell my patent, I can license my patent. As you heard with Christina Peterson talking earlier, that's an important part of how the telco ecosystem funds the future development, is that we're able to do that we're able to transact on patents. Also, another layer to this is trade secrets, and trade secrets are the things you choose to keep secret. They're not really well suited for open source because, as you know, with open source, it's not secret, it's out there, right? So you can of course keep trade secrets on like the stuff you build on top of open source, but for things you intend to put on open source, you're pretty much not going to have trade secret on those. And then finally, sort of in this multi-layer protection, trademarks. I know next to nothing about trademarks, so I'm not going to talk much about them. So, as said, doing a little bit of comparison of licenses here. So what we have in the one end, we have the OAI license, or rather all of these licenses. They manage this copyright in slightly different ways. BSD style licenses, Apache, which is what the OAI license is based on, and GPL, which is what, for example, Linux kernel is licensed under. They all manage copyright slightly different, but fundamentally they grant you the right to study, modify, and redistribute. Same for OAI license, it gives you those rights, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have a community around this code if we couldn't do that. Where these differ, it's sort of how we decided to manage patents. So in, for example, the BSD case, there's no explicit patent license grant. There's arguments as to if there is an implied license, if that was intended by the original authors of those licenses or not. I mean, we can probably argue until the cows come home about how that should be, and lawyers have done that, and there's been lengthy articles written about that, if there is a patent license or not. But the fact is, we probably won't know until someone litigates the matter and have that decided by a court. And that sort of actually brings us to an interesting point, which is on the bottom here, that the open source license, typically, they don't have a choice of law provision or a venue provision. And a choice of law provision is saying, well, we're going to interpret this agreement or this contract or this license according to the laws of, XYZ country. Like, could be the laws of Sweden, could be the laws of the US, could be laws of France. Or a venue provision which says we're going to use this court. If we are in disagreement, we're going to use this court. But typically, open source licenses don't have that. Again, OpenAirInterface is different, and we'll get to that part and why it's important. I would say, if we move to Apache, it does contain an explicit patent license grant for those patents that are necessarily infringed by your contributions for patents you can grant a license to. So say that I were to implement something in Apache, I don't have the patent on it, that's held by some other company. My contribution cannot bind them. They're a third party. It's not my right to give away, right? And so you have a rather small sphere. And these licenses then depend on the fact that sort of there is a community around this. You wouldn't sue into the community because you might have an own dependence on this, but they can't really extend the scope much beyond that. It's bound to sort of the fact that we're trying to create incentives not to assert your patents in this ecosystem. Again, the telco ecosystem is different. It has chosen a different way of granting this access, right? And again, the OAI license tries to manage this or manages this by referring back to those FRAND commitments. And again, it's a different way of ensuring that there is access. And in my view, it's probably a better way because it's broader. It goes back to sort of if something is standard essential, then we refer that to the established rules that we had for 30 years in, for example, ETSI, on how do we make that patented technology available. And the whole sort of body of law around that because FRAND has been, despite the vast majority of licenses being patent licenses in the telco ecosystem being signed without litigation, there's been litigation, which is more than you can say for example, BSD, Apache, or GPL. There's been very little litigation or very little determinations in court that provides clarity. But at least with FRAND, we have a lot of clarity if we compare to that. Also, there is great clarity for academia with the OpenAirInterface license, because when that was written, one of the things that we wanted to accomplish was to ensure that for academic research, for non-commercial purposes, there was access, there was freedom, and no one should have to worry about that, right? Without sort of necessarily threatening the business model or needing to change the business model of how we fund future research, which is licensing commercial implementations of the same technology. Also, I think it's interesting because kind of due to this, the OAI license does have a provision for choice of law. It says French law. But it doesn't say which court, but at least it's French law. So it gives us some clarity on that. So all of this taken together, I mean, we've seen, like, at least in the 4G era and before that, we'd seen projects trying to implement a 5G stack under all of these licenses. I think if you look at who have managed to build a community around that, who has sort of, in my view, probably the best stack, today it's OAI. And I think large part of that is that it recognizes like the functioning of this ecosystem, how it works, that we have pre-existing commitments to standards bodies. So I think that that is a very important thing. If you want to sort of create a community around this, you need to have sort of at least some of the incumbents on board for this. And the only way to get that is by sort of recognizing that there is a commercial reality that they need to relate to. And I think the OpenAirInterface license accomplishes that by this FRAND clause, which is pretty much the only modification to that, and the choice of law is the only modification to Apache. So, provocative question, is the OAI license still fit for purpose in the 6G era? And I would say that it is. Maybe it's not perfect. Maybe there are things we could tweak. But fundamentally, the industry logic of FRAND and standard essential patents have not changed. So since that fundamental industry logic haven't changed, I still think the idea behind the OpenAirInterface public license of providing clarity for academia, of providing sort of allowing for patent-owning companies to come in and contribute without sort of necessarily damaging the revenue stream, without necessarily sort of damaging their FRAND commitment or making something that's not compatible with their FRAND commitment. Allowing for that haven't changed. That fundamental idea is still sound. So is there things we could change? Yeah, because it's not perfect. Maybe for a 6G implementation, it's time to update the license. I'm saying update, not overhaul, because it's minor updates. Like some of the things that we could look, maybe some of the wording in the FRAND clause could be improved for greater clarity. There could be some minor text edits. And maybe it's time to embrace the chaos and remove the choice of law provision. It's funny because like the first thing they teach you if you do a contracting class in law school is like you need to have choice of law, otherwise you don't know how this will be interpreted and how it will be done. And I think that's a great, it's somewhat of a flaw in many open source licenses, the fact that we don't have that, because it leaves, there is this concept of forum shopping that you select the most favorable court to you. But normally that's sort of limited within sort of one legal system. With open source, that's wide open. So could litigate this anywhere under any country's laws. So for example, with BSD, it doesn't have an explicit patent license the way Apache or GPL version 3 or the OAI license would. So it's implied. Okay. So how you should read in a obligation that's implied in a contract or a license, that differs greatly between, for example, the United States and Sweden. So if I wanted a certain outcome, I would certainly look into which legal system is more favorable here. I don't think that's necessarily good for providing predictability and clarity. On the other hand, it's no successful open source license that's been adopted by more projects than one ever had that clause. I mean, Ericsson have the dubious pleasure of probably having the least successful open source license ever with the Erlang public license. That was adopted by exactly one project, and that was the Erlang project. And even that project has since moved on to Apache because it's more well understood. But that license had the provision that it was Swedish law that would apply, and it would be the municipal court of Stockholm that was the venue. I mean, if you're a lawyer, that's great. That gives you clarity. However, if you're a developer, that kind of thing is scary. You don't understand it. And even if you are a lawyer, but you're an American lawyer, then that's kind of scary because Sweden, I don't know, is that where they build the cuckoo clocks or IKEA? I don't know. Strange country, right? And I definitely don't know anything about their law. So there's probably more lawyers than there are people lawyers in the US than there are people in Sweden. So finding a Swedish lawyer then got to be really hard. So despite the fact that we get clarity from the choice of law provision that we have in the OAI license, maybe it's time to embrace the case, say we'll have to live with that. Maybe that's a way for greater adoption by more. It's not sort of good legal advice, but it's sort of maybe good ecosystem advice. But I think that's something we need to discuss, and I think sort of the ramp up to the 6G era and the 6G stack is probably the perfect time to talk about that. Let's see, did I have anything else? No. So I didn't have any further slides, at least. I still have some time, so I will sort of bother you with one more thing. So we have this quite unique license, this quite unique community that's sort of really brought everyone on board. I think that that's something we should value and something we should treasure. And as you heard my colleague Christina before me, the fact that we can license patents in this ecosystem, and that's how it's been built, and that's fueling sort of future R&D, that's so incredibly important. And I don't think that sort of abandoning that is not a great path forward. I think rather sort of that needs to be embraced. And sort of this is something we should be proud of with this project because it is something that's different for a reason. It's not just different because we want it to be different. We designed this to be business friendly. And I think we're accomplishing that. I think sort of the people and the companies represented in this room is a great testament to the fact that this is a very business friendly license. It's possible to implement it commercially. We see some companies over with the demos doing that. It's possible to use in research, and it's possible to do that with great clarity and sort of at the same time having some of the big incumbents on board with doing that. And it is sort of open, it's collaborative, and it does give us sort of the clarity we need to work with for a company like Ericsson to contribute into this. And as I said, I think fundamentally it's still a sound license. It's still a sound idea because the industry logic haven't changed. And if we update it, it should be minor tweaks because the fundament is still there. But with that, let's open up for questions.
Questions, comments? Sridhar? Yes, Sridhar first, and then you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. If you go to the comparison table thing, right?
Sure.
In the third row, you mentioned no clarity for academia. I mean, I'm sorry, isn't by default all these three licenses providing very clear instructions to this academia? As a student or as a researcher, I know what to do with these licenses, right?
Do you?
Sorry?
Do you?
Of course.
Okay, so BSD, do you know exactly
I have never heard, I'm from Linux Foundation, right?
Yep.
We use all these three licenses extensively.
Yes.
I have never heard any academia coming and ask me, hey, can you clarify this license? What can I do with this? Never, ever. Whereas any other license other than these three, there is a clarity for the academia. I thought by default setting is clarity for academia is there in these three.
Well, I should probably say that BSD doesn't really provide me any clarity either as industry.
No, from academia. So no student or a faculty has come today and said, hey, this is the BSD license.
The fact that no student or academia has come doesn't mean that there is clarity. It means that they think there is clarity. I think there's a difference.
Or can you give me an example of what clarity they're looking for?
Okay, so BSD. Do I have a patent license under BSD? If I'm an academic researcher, who do I need to talk to? Do I need to talk to someone? Do I have all the rights I need? Apache. I implement a project under Apache. Who do I talk to for a patent license? Like, is there a list? Like, I understand that I will have some of the licenses I need from the contributors, but do I need to map their contribution into this? Do I know if they're using this? Same for GPL v2. There's no clarity, well, either for industry or academia, if there exists a patent license grant or not.
No, why would an academia do that kind of comparison? For he has to focus on his thing, right? For his non-commercial use, these three are very clear when it comes to non-commercial use, isn't it?
Raymond? I don't agree with that. Not all universities are interested just in free use of their scientific results. There are many academic and non-profit research organizations that monetize their scientific outcome. And if they do that, they cannot contribute to any of these. Sorry? In that case, do you bucketize still them as academia? What do you mean, packetize? I mean, categorize them as an academia, or they may be a startup within academia. No, they could be universities. I mean, today in some countries, there's very strong push for universities and research centers to actually get involved in 3GPP and generate innovation. If they're doing that, and with any of those licenses, they're throwing any possibility for monetization in the garbage.
So let me address one more thing with that. So I'm not saying these are bad licenses. They're very successful licenses. There are some very good things with them. We participate in many projects with these licenses. Do I think they're right for a RAN stack? If we put it in the context of a RAN stack, for 5G or 6G or beyond, do I think those are good licenses for that? No. Do I think they provide clarity, either for industry or academia? No. Do I think the OAI license provides great clarity? Yes. I saw that we had one more question.
Yeah, I'll be very quick, don't worry.
I might not be quick with my answer.
Okay, yeah, that's expected, thank you. So can we generalize this? So I think this is a great example, and I think it's now also the time where we need to push open source for 6G. Open source and maybe even the startup bubble. So my question is, will Ericsson build, or does Ericsson maybe have already a patent licensing program for open source based startups?
So that's a very interesting question. But the fact is, from a licensing perspective, open source is just another implementation. So in a sense, yes, we don't have a separate one for open source.
Okay, that is the answer I was looking for. Yeah, are you planning to build one? Maybe to push the open source and startup base of 6G?
That would have been a great question from my former colleague that was here.
Ask her.
And I would say you were very brave. A lot of brave questions from the audience, because trying to get a straight answer from a lawyer is not easy. Yeah. So, but to address your question, I don't know if that's in the works, but I don't see that there's a fundamental difference between if your business model is open source or your business model is proprietary. From a patent perspective, it's the same technology being implemented. So if we compare this to a handset, a UE, frankly, from a licensing perspective, it doesn't really matter if you give away the UE for free or if you charge money for it, if you rent it, it still implements the same technology, right? So the underlying, as I said before, FRAND is implementation agnostic to your business model. But your business model is up to you, right?
Laurent, please.
For small companies, it's not only patents now. It is all the regulation. You have to have CE marking. You have to do so many things that, in fact, small companies cannot sell anything. It's not only patents. It's all the business.
So, overregulation in EU, yes, a big problem. Overregulation elsewhere, also a big problem. That's been pointed out by, among others, our CEO. So I think we have no problem signing on that overregulation is an issue, and especially for sort of an ecosystem like ours and small startups trying to break into that. I would say patents is probably like low on that list of worries, where it should be. Any sort of last comments or questions? Otherwise, we'll head to lunch.
Naveed has a question.
So thanks, Jimmy. I have like two questions.
Naveed, could you please introduce yourself, especially
Yes.
the Bubble RAN angle?
Yes, I'm Naveed from Bubble RAN and also Eurecom and also OAI board member.
You wear a lot of hats.
Yes. Two questions. Do you think OAI license is only applicable to the telco space, or is it wider than telco space? If, for instance, we look into ORAN specification, X apps, R apps, and also if we look into AI applications, right? Would OAI license still be relevant to be applied in those space, or should we keep it only at the level of 3GPP?
I think probably market experimentation is a good way to figure that out, right?
Yeah.
It's like we could definitely try to spin up projects under that. Either there's adoption or there's no adoption. I would see those things as sort of very close to the telco ecosystem and sort of included in that bubble. But there's probably room for experimentation, and either it will be successful and sort of drive large vendors and small coming together, because that's sort of when you will have sort of any value in open source is when you have the ecosystem coming together like that. And then to do another comparable, like if you look at media coding, so like they're the ecosystem fundamenta of how you fund further research in form of patent licensing. It's very similar to telco. It's also kind of part of telco because we implement those standards. But the industry fundamenta is very similar. So I think there are projects under the OAI license for implementing some of these, and they're relatively successful. I think it's a good model to apply when you have a similar industry logic of patents are needed to fund further research and to be able to invest in standardization.
Thank you.
Any other last questions? Doug? Comment, I suppose.
I just want to add one slight bit of clarification there. It might muddy the water, but when we're talking about open source licenses having any grant or lack of grant with regard to patents, the only thing that the open source license is talking about is patents that are reflected in that open source code. And in most cases, I think in all of these cases, only to the portion of code that came from the contributor that has the patent.
If
So-
that contribution or
so-
that
Right.
the
So
combination
I
of that
think there's a
contribution.
lot of misunderstanding out there. People look at the Apache license and they think, oh, I'm home free.
Yeah,
I've got Apache because it says I have a royalty-free grant to the patents.
yeah.
When that code implements things that are defined by industry standards that have patent policies like FRAND in them, you are still obligated by every company by the patents that are implied by those underlying standards. What the OAI license enables is for companies that have intellectual property. It allows them to contribute to the open source code without fear of compromising their rights that they have by nature of being contributors to the standard. And so for companies, organizations, universities, whomever is the IP holder, the end user or the user of the open source code is never off the hook for the patents that are implied by the underlying standards. And the other thing is, if you can build a community and bring in more companies that are IP holders and bring them in with contributions, you get more assurance, at least in what Jimmy was saying about the clarity for academia. At least the OAI license does make it clear that if you use that code, that the contributor of the code cannot have submarined a patent in there and then go sue your academic use of that code. Actually, I think it says research use, right? Doesn't it? Or is it only academic?
I mean, I should know this, but
I don't remember. I think it's research purposes.
Defined as like non-commercial.
That's what it is.
Non-commercial. I believe that companies can use the code for research purposes
Yes.
as long as they don't commercialize it also.
Yeah.
So it's clear for academia and research purposes. So I wish that there was a perfect world where for certain segments of the domain, usages could be much more clear. But the reality in the world we live in, when we have radio technology standards that are so complex and require so many billions of dollars worth of R&D to develop those radio technologies, the natural selection process in the world economy has decided that the best way to do that and have an ecosystem of products that talk together so your cell phone can work around the world is to use methods like the 3GPP system with the FRAN model that enables that kind of very expensive R&D. And it's not perfect, it's not ideal. It makes things, it brings the lawyers into play. But unfortunately, I think in this domain, that's really about the best solution you're going to have. Anywhere where you get close to hardware that's massively expensive to do research and development for is going to have those kind of limitations.
And I think just one more thing before we close. So I think what we need to remember is, again, patents, it's a negative right. It's the right to exclude, say to everyone else, this is mine. No one else gets to use this. FRAND is a modification to that, saying that since it's now part of the standard, I'm willing to grant access on fair, reasonable terms, right, to that. If you look at, for example, the patent grant in Apache, you get a subset of the patents. You can't even look at who is a contributor into Apache and say, I get all their patents. No, you need to look at what did they contribute. Did that necessarily infringe their patent? And if so, yes, you have a grant to that patent. But, right, if their patent is implemented somewhere else in the code, well, you don't have a grant. So there is that sort of unclarity, and I think it's unfair to say that because it's open source, it's royalty free. That's not really a true statement, because there's definitely companies outside of this, and an example of that is all the litigation around Kubernetes currently, because we're seeing that it's a lot of patents, and some patents formerly owned by contributors to Kubernetes are being litigated.
So I think we need to step back a little and see where these licenses came from and the purpose that they've served. Pardon?
Yeah, please go ahead. Please.
Yeah. So the success in open source in technology has been Linux. Okay, let's not, that's the precursor. That's what has defined this whole world of open source, the spirit of open source and the purpose. And we saw the explosion that has happened in the IT industry because of that. So many variations, so many applications, the internet happening, right? All of that happened because of opening up the code and so much. And this step jump that we are doing from 4G into the 5G, 6G and beyond world is demanding that. We are seeing that keeping it closed is not making all those applications happen that need to happen in the way that people will find it useful and that will create, meet their purpose and create business and create development in the community. By pulling it back and keeping it, keeping it closed and making all kinds of arguments for it. Okay, I invested in R&D. How many years you want to keep milking that R&D? You invested, you made profit. Okay. You had a business. Now let it, let the world use that whatever it was and move forward and advance the world and advance technology. I think we are blocking the advancement of technology by doing this.
I think we're granting access to technology, and I think it's unfair to say all of that.
You can have your code, and you can say my code. If you use my code, you pay me for it. But if somebody else writes their own code, let them contribute their own code and open it up. What's the big deal? So,
what I must say is that, OAI has, over the years, acquired some maturity in this topic. We understand the concerns because, each industry is different. That's also an important aspect. This whole idea of Linux of something, it's like, everybody wants to make Airbnb of something, Airbnb of parking. I tried that. It didn't work. Trying to be Uber of something, it just doesn't work. So, this simplistic perspective, I'm not saying it for you, but, in general, there are many people who believe that you can build a Linux of something else. It just is not. There's no guarantee that it works. You have to take the dynamics of the industry into account. And one more thing that, Sridhar presenting Linux Foundation. We have had discussions with Linux Foundation on this topic, and for several projects, in fact, Linux Foundation did accept the OAI public license to be the license under which the code for this 3GPP related technology will be accepted. OSC is, for example, a good place, Linux Foundation OSC project, ORAN software community, where there is a repo in which you can contribute code under the OAI public license. We worked on this together, right? So and it has happened in other places as well. In the case of Magma, that OAI seeded, there again we found a compromise, and Linux Foundation did compromise with us because they understood that there was dynamics of this industry were different. So those aspects everybody understands. At times, people have a tendency of taking this, dogmatic position, but I don't think that is the right approach. We also need to move forward, consider the specific aspects or qualities or reasons why this industry has in fact evolved this way and why it's so different from the others. So that's our position at OAI.
So happy to continue the conversation over lunch, over fika, over the demos, over beer later. That's fine. I don't want to keep people necessarily any longer from lunch, but I'm just going to say I don't think open source and open standards are fundamentally opposing each other. It's different frameworks for how we collaborate on something across company borders, across academia, across company, and they're both very successful in their domains. They're both managed to find sort of how do we do this. It's all about open innovation, right? And the fundamental that if we collaborate on something, sort of it will be greater than the sum of its parts. How we make that available and how we deal with certain sort of realities, such as patents and copyrights, that's treated differently in these. But it's two systems that have co-evolved. But they're just two different flavors of open innovation. Another flavor is if I have a collaboration agreement with Qualcomm, that's also open innovation, but it's a different flavor, right? But with that said, happy to discuss this further throughout the day. There's obviously a great interest in discussing it. I don't know if it's a great interest to continue to listen to it for the rest of the audience, but that's a different question. But lunch is served up there in the Barcelona room.